Thank you very much, Sophia. Our next speaker, Kiki Mazzucchelli, is an independent curator and writer based, working between London and Sao Paulo. And like Sophia, she's also a PhD candidate at Chelsea College of Arts. And also, like Sophia, she's attached to the Research Centre for Transnational Arts, Identity and Nation, TRAIN for short. Her research focuses, her wider research for her PhD focuses on the exhibition histories in Brazil and about Brazilian art. And she will be looking or speculating on possible relations in a kind of trying to kind of critically question issues of precedents or legacies and influences and so on. We're looking at how Mira Schendel's work might relate to works and practices within contemporary arts. So, thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank Michael and Tanya for inviting me to participate in this discussion today, and Hannah for her help with organization. In this paper, I'm going to try to explore some aspects of Mira Schendel's work, which I think have been a bit overlooked by recent historiography in Brazil, and try to make some connections with the work of some contemporary artists from Brazil as well. So, with an artistic production spanning almost 40 years, Mira Schendel was an extremely prolific artist who created a body of works which occupies a very singular place in Brazilian art history. And although her work is fairly well known in the local art circle, she seems to have escaped the international revisionism of Brazilian artists connected to neo-concretism that has taken place in the past 2 decades. In this, which is a very experimental paper, I will not attempt to make a historical analysis of her work or try to place it in relation to specific genealogies. Rather, what interests me is to look into ways in which some aspects of her work seem to resonate in some contemporary practices from Brazil. I have to say that I speak strictly from the viewpoint of someone who was born and brought up in São Paulo and has experienced Schendel's work since it attained a more widespread visibility in the mid-80s. But my experience has always been that of the viewer and not of a researcher or curator, perhaps precisely because of my difficulty in placing her work in relation to her contemporaries. Recently, however, I have been increasingly coming across works and discourses by contemporary Brazilian artists who seem interested in working with issues that may somehow be related to one particular aspect of Schendel's work. That is her lifelong engagement with philosophical and spiritual questions which underpin the manner in which her work developed a very distinctive trajectory. Having arrived in Porto Alegre in 1949, where she started to work as an artist, Schendel soon moved to São Paulo in 1953 and witnessed some significant transformations in the local art circuit at the time. In the previous decade, the city had undergone an unprecedented surge of industrialization, which had a direct impact on what was until then a very incipient art circuit. In the early 50s, the city had 3 art museums, 2 of which had been recently inaugurated with financial support from the private sector. MAS, Museu de Arte de São Paulo, was conceived by Italian dealer Pietro Maria Bardi and his wife Lina Bo, and financed by communications tycoon Assis Chateaubriand, and it opened in 1947. And MAN, the Museu de Arte Moderna de São Paulo, was created by Italian businessman Cicillo Matarazzo in 1948. In addition to that, in 1951, the first São Paulo Bienal would take place, also organized by Matarazzo. As though anticipating or capturing the local interest in constructive tendencies, the jury of the first biennial famously awarded the international prize to the Swiss concrete artist Max Biel's tripartite unit, a work from 48-49, a sculpture based on the principle of the Möbius strip. Biel's work had already been shown in a comprehensive exhibition at MASP in 1951, causing a significant impact on a young generation of artists both from Rio and São Paulo. The local scene seemed to have been infused with a new dynamism, and concrete art, and later neo-concrete art, would be the dominant trend in the decade. Schendel had been working regularly with painting in the beginning of the 50s, producing works in subdued tones where the figure was still present, although in a schematic way. And she continued to pursue her own research. In spite of having moved to São Paulo partly because she felt too isolated in Porto Alegre, and of having participated in the first São Paulo Biennial as part of the Open Submissions exhibition, she nevertheless maintained a certain distance to the local art scene. As critic Sonia Saulstein describes, and I quote, it is no accident that during her first decades in Brazil, Schendel rarely took part in the small local artistic scene. One of the few people from the intellectual and artistic circles with whom she would initiate a continuous dialogue in that period was the physicist and art critic Mario Schoenberg, at the time an enthusiastic advocate of the possibility of establishing connections between scientific debate and contemporary artistic developments. It is also worth recalling, as testimony to Schendel's growing extra-artistic motivations, the engrossing theological and philosophical discussions with São Paulo Dominican clerics, in which she participated from the 60s to the beginning of the following decade. In the early 60s, when she produced works which showed a more rigorous approach to geometry, these could have been interpreted as an approximation to the São Paulo concrete art trends. But as Mário Pedrosa writes on the brochure from Mira Schendel's exhibition at Galeria São Luís in São Paulo in 1963, this formal approximation still maintained a very distinct character, and I quote, "Form ceases to be form, living plastic form. Color, on its turn, which was previously isolated, can no longer be distinguished. Less than hue, it is matter. It becomes present not only because of its most evident and quantifiable property, extension, but due to the sensible quality of its intensity. Concretism becomes dense and achieves another dimension, that of a subjective expression with real emotional impact." At the time, Schendel was also making several experiments with extra-artistic materials, adding sawdust, broken glass, and etc. to oil or tempera, and experimenting with industrial paints and resin, a process that highlighted the materiality of the painting layers. As Geraldo Souza Dias, who is here with us today, mentions in the publication Mira Schendel do Espiritual à Corporeidade, or From the Spiritual to the Corporeal, Schoenberg, who was one of her few close interlocutors, saw in the circle a relationship with the mandala, a symbol that Schendel would later explore in a series she produced in the 1970s. And he continues, "In the mid-60s, the geometric forms became progressively irregular and asymmetrical in relation to the edges of the support and conveyed emotional intensity, therefore escaping the general principles of concretism." Souza Dias mentions how Mario Schoenberg introduced Mira to Eastern art. In writing about her work in 1964 for the brochure of an exhibition at Galeria Astrea, Schoenberg describes how she started to incorporate some aspects of Eastern art in her own work. He writes, quote, "To the experience of the romantic, so intensely lived during her youth in Lombardy, the cosmic vision of the Far East started to appear, which had been revealed by reproductions of Qi Panshai, the great master of contemporary Chinese painting. She gradually discovered nature, not the kind of nature related to a naive view, but the one that emerged from a passion for the absolute, when transcendence becomes immanence." He also suggests an approximation between the vast empty spaces of her canvases and the Buddhist tradition, and I quote again, "Some works are similar to the pure space of contemporary artists. Others could be called nirvanic, evoking the mysterious Mahayan conception of the void, sunyata. Schoenberg was not the only one to point out the distinctive relationship with philosophical, metaphysical, and religious issues that Mira Schendel consistently maintained throughout her life. Although born into a Jewish family, she was raised Catholic, but later in life said to be agnostic. In the late 1960s, she became very involved with the theology of liberation, which was committed to fighting the military dictatorship in Brazil. Throughout her career, the relationship with philosophy and religion would become more or less explicitly manifested in her works, but it was very much present in her writings, suggesting that this was an ongoing concern. In her 1996 essay on Schendel titled Full Transparency, critic Lisette Lanhado states that the artist explored the ineffable and the numinous, asking the question, what does silence hold? Lanhado's essay is particularly interesting because it proposes an interpretation of language in Schendel's monotypes and graphic objects that is deeply connected to the metaphysical and spiritual questions that seem to be at the heart of her artistic research. In the series of monotypes produced from 1964, Schendel explores lines, letters, and writings, but in a very different way, for example, to her North American counterparts. According to Lanhado, she was not interested in metalinguistic issues or in the exhaustion of language. In fact, her goal was to establish a secret expression, meditative in nature. For Lanhado, Schendel meditated on unities that were both grandiose and indivisible at one and the same time. The universe, the creation of the world, events, the whole, the sun, the sea, movement, duration, the point, the circle, the square, the new, the other. She also stresses how important was the fact that Schendel spoke many languages, as the monotypes contains words in Croatian, English, German, Italian, Portuguese, and French, stating that her freedom of movement between languages allowed her to accumulate effects that are normally lost in translation. In this sense, in her works, a word is not merely a carrier of one single and stable meaning, but it contains within itself, in the shape of the letters that form it or in the context to which it relates, a certain power to convey a wider set of meanings and effects. And this is a quote from Lanhado. It is certain that Germany's philosophical tradition confers a weightier significance on the word Welt, that is carried by the word world. On the other hand, something purely sensorial convinces us that the open phonetics of Joko is more playful than game. Thus, she suggests that in Schendel's work, language doesn't seem to be strictly connected to the written word or merely used as a graphic element. It is also invested with a temporality, not exactly the temporality of reading, but maybe that of the utterance, without any connection to a specific meaning. Talking about one of her works, Lanhado describes how the letter A is repeated in different lines, flowing, victorious, and aspiring to the fullness of the vowel that must be pronounced with open lips. The air released by the sound of A, or A, the lengthy emission of that which signifies the beginning, can be invested with overtones of sighs, of yawns, of pleasure. This temporality and the relation with the being here of the body are also evident in the transparency of the graphic object series, which are those drawings on Japanese paper mounted between acrylic plates that she did from 1967 to 72, and this is one of them. These were left hanging in space, superimposing the writings, simultaneously saturated and vaporous. In relation to these, Lanhado states that it becomes urgent to bring both body and mind to a self-organized system without making a detour through representation. And she relates this to the Bergsonian idea of duration. And this was actually translated in the journal where I find the article as endurance, but I'm sure she meant duration. So I quote, the search for duration, in a Bergsonian sense, revives the transitory realm where transparency is a principle of simultaneities that never cease, a forever folded and multiplied origin. This folded, multiple character identified by Lanhado is further demonstrated in her analysis of a series of drawings from the mid-80s, in which she examines Schendel's use of the microparticle no, N-O, as the amalgam of polysemic ambiguity. And I quote again, "No signifies negation, rejection, the negative. At the same time, in Portuguese, no is the prepositional contraction of en and o, no, or in English, in thee, conjuring up interior directed action. In addition, in mathematical language, n is an indeterminate quantity, and 0 is both the annulling void as well as the element which, when added to a different element, reproduces the latter. In other words, the other is reduced to itself, and 0 level corresponds to n points. Thus, after so many interminable turns, the line merges with infinity and is capable of making the passage, its strength, although incommensurate, maintains a surface sensitivity to action." Unquote. This approximation between Schendel's approach to language and the idea of the ineffable and the numinous seemed to make even more sense if we look at her own writings and that of some of her close interlocutors. In some of her works, such as Still Waves of Probability, Book of Kings, conceived in 1969 for the Bienal de São Paulo, this becomes more explicit. The installation consists of 20,000 threads of nylon hanging from the ceiling, forming a semi-transparent three-dimensional block that extends to the floor. It is accompanied by a text that contains a quote from the Bible, and which refers to the impossibility to grasp the voice of God. But this aspect also appears in her writings, and her letter to P leaves no doubt about her ongoing interest and complex relationship with religious matters. And I quote from the letter. "Religion is at the center of my thoughts. I experience religion as never before. I think about God with indescribable anguish and passion. In truth, maybe we should talk discreetly about God. We know from experience that man is not always religious, truly thinking about and living religion. We know that religion is something that can be variously expressed or cannot be expressed. We know that man can escape his destiny, religion, through religious means. We can intuit or at least know that God expects something very different from man, and man expects something very different from God. That the relationship between God and man is in reality a relationship between the finite and the infinite in an infinite proximity, and maybe, who knows, a very real immanence. And that the relationship is a constant operation, a freeing oneself from presence, etc." Unquote. Also, I should mention a text that Willem Flusser wrote about Schendel's work in 1966. And I quote again, "Our language, such as it is devoid of surprises. It is tedious, and all our thoughts within it are devoid of the climate of the sacred. Schendel's art is an attempt to open up language to allow the sacred, the unutterable, to enter it. It is an opening up towards the totally different, which is non-language. This is the reason we see in it letters and words and lines floating in emptiness of the sacred, trying to inform themselves and each other within the emptiness and losing themselves in it again. We are present at the origin of structure. We are therefore witnesses to the effort to build a bridge between the realm of what can be said and the realm of what must be silenced. Schendel's is the anti-Wittgensteinian shout in defiance of the unutterable. It is a prayer." Unquote. So I'm just going to go through these images of Mira Schendel's work before I get to the second part of this text. I think we've seen all of these yesterday, so it'll be quick. So, what interests me in the singular relationship maintained by Schendel with aspects that may be loosely described as spiritual or mystical is how they seem to have re-emerged recently in the discourse and production of some contemporary Brazilian artists. These particular aspects seem to be more difficult to incorporate in a historiography that has mainly focused on the more formal characteristics of her work. It may be worth mentioning that she only achieved a more widespread recognition among Brazilian art critics in the 80s, a little while before her death. This was precisely the decade when neo-expressionist tendencies in painting dominated the local São Paulo circuit. There was certainly a renewed interest on the materiality of painting, but also on a more organic approach to abstraction, which may have contributed to the discovery of Schendel's work, but also to certain readings which tended to privilege its formal aspects over spiritual ones. And this is these are two images from a series that Paulo Monteiro has developed for more than 10 years, which are investigations around line. He was one of the main figures in this context of the neo-expressionist tendencies in São Paulo. He was a member of a group called Casa Sete, where these artists revolved around. However, the current context may provide a more conducive environment for a reassessment of her engagement with the spiritual. International exhibitions such as Animism, that took place at Extra City in Antwerp 2010 and then traveled to Bern by Anselm Frank, for instance, sought to examine the idea of animism beyond the 19th century concept that saw it as a pre-modern social and psychological mechanism by means of which nature and things were erroneously endowed with souls and agency. I quote from the presentation of the project. This project seeks to move beyond those mistaken but sedimented commonplaces that have narrowed the understanding of animism to a matter of belief and psychology, and instead raise questions about the collective practices of humans and non-humans and the qualitative relations that they produce. The term is employed like a mirror in an investigation of modern cosmography, reversing its underlying assumptions, and in particular, the way in which modernity conceived of the boundary between life and non-life, unquote. Last year, Brazilian curator Márcio Harum organized the group show Meditation Trance at Galeria Mendes Wood in São Paulo, which was based on the premise that the concentration necessary to empty the mind is one which engenders a perspective free of historical entails. The reflective or meditative exercise of extreme concentration gives primacy to experience as opposed to formalist preoccupations. In the presentation of the show, he writes, Meditation Trance brings together works that make use of the absence of matter as a means to achieve a sort of transcendental expression, one which approximates the purity of insight attained in states of trance or meditation. The works brought together here insist on the locus of the body and its gestures as opposed to medium, painting, photography, etc., and in this way are recollective of ritual or dance practice. Each has a quality of apparition, of the real seen through, of revelation, fantastical, yet consistent with the viewer's own desires and uncertainties. In this way, meditation trance posits the ontological and the mysterious as the essence of art. Similar resonances can be found in the discourse and in the works of several Brazilian artists from my generation. Among these is Renata Lucas, who has often referred to her works as entities, suggesting a relationship with the Afro-Brazilian candomblé divinities which are so prominent in everyday Brazilian religion and culture. In fact, one of her works from 2001, a site-specific installation in which she reproduced the walls of the gallery using plywood panels, was titled Barra Vento, the turning wind. which is both the title of a Glaubert Horscher film from 1962, but it also refers to a drumming rhythm used in candomblé rituals to induce a state of trance or possession. In this work, the plywood panels could be extended or contracted, moved to the center or pushed to the sides, therefore constructing a flexible, modifiable space within the static one. This operation could be somehow related to the candomblé entities insofar as the changes effected in spatial perception are conducive to different states of mind in the viewer-participant. Intervening on existing space, sometimes very subtly, and the mental effect that these interventions cause on people is an ongoing concern in Lucas's work. For Documenta 13, picture there, in 2012, she created an installation, Yesterday Quicksands, formed by the four edges of a pyramid which were built in 4 different underground locations, which seemed to be the base of a large archaeological monument. It also included a fictional video which could be streamed on the visitors' mobile phones, tablets, or computers, showing the city of Kassel being swept by a sandstorm. In an interview to the newspaper O Estado de São Paulo, the artist stated that she had chosen the pyramid because it is a common element, but also a mathematically calculated geometric solid and common to many cultures. But beyond any mystical aspect intrinsic to it, the pyramid references to the monumentality of Documenta, its mythic character, the way in which lots of people come to Kassel after a sign. Here, rather than using a literal image to refer to the spiritual, Lucas is commenting on the mythologies and belief systems associated to this large-scale international exhibition. But she's also performing the same operation as in previous works, creating interventions which are capable of evoking specific entities. Another Brazilian artist who has been investigating issues related to spiritual and religious matters is Copenhagen-based Tamar Guimarães. Her most widely known project is perhaps A Man Called Love from 2008, a slide projection with voice-over based on Francisco Cândido Xavier, who lived from 1910 to 2002, and who was a very popular figure in Brazil, commonly known as Chico Xavier. Xavier was a Brazilian civil servant who became famous as a psychic medium and a psychographer, ascribed to the spirits, and has been described as the biggest and most prolific psychographer worldwide at all times, having written over 400 books. In the 60s and 70s, he was a celebrity in Brazil, drawing large crowds whenever he appeared in public. In this work, and in the homonymous book published in 2010, Guimarães uses the figure of Chico Xavier in order to discuss race and class relations in Brazil and the military dictatorship which lasted from 64 to 85, the period of Xavier's greatest popularity. According to her, his version of Spiritism was at once deeply utopian and deeply conservative, and A Man Called Love brings out the societal fault lines underlying his practice, intertwining Xavier, the military dictatorship, and its resistance. In a work from 2009, Duralex Sedlex no Cabelo Sogomex, she also explored the idea of altered states of conscience in the form of hypnosis. As part of this project, she went to Dresden to meet the president at the Supreme Court of Appeals. He had agreed to read from the memoirs of one of his predecessors, Daniel Paul Schreber, under a state of hypnosis. Schreber suffered from a mental breakdown shortly after he had been appointed to his position as Senate's president in 1893. Schreber's memoirs, published after his release from a mental asylum, account for real and delusional persecution, political intrigue, and states of sexual ecstasy as God's private concubine. The meeting with the High Court judge and the hypnotist was recorded onto acetate record, a letter, and a few photographs. According to the artist, as a whole, the project is a continuation of my investigation of states of rapture and the intersection with the state of law and authority. Another project from 2009, pictured there, the silent black and white film Tropical Blow-Up, is based on photographs from two Brazilian tabloid newspapers active in the 1960s, as well as the artist's own photographic work. The images were found in the São Paulo State Archive under the rubric Urban Crime. In one of the photographs, a man points at a clearance in the bush where something or someone once was or should have been. In another image, sectioned in parts, a woman's corpse lies on the ground, half naked and partly mutilated, one shoe still on, while two elderly people who probably found the corpse point at it. This gruesome image is sectioned in Tropical Blow-Up in such a way that the viewer only momentarily sees a fraction of the woman's shoe and part of her hand. Speaking about the project, Guimarães says, "Combined with my own foliage garden images, the result is a dreamy and uncanny experience. As a whole, Tropical Blow-Up intertwines two traditional fields of the medium of photography. One scrutinizes a photographic image for forensic and documentary evidence of the natural world, and the other references the tradition of spirit photography, which in this tropical setting is a reminder that the ethereal practices of spiritism and communication with the dead are part and parcel of a context where lives are lost cheaply." Tamar Guimarães' work explicitly underscores the prominent role played by spiritual beliefs at the heart of Brazilian society, but her approach is often more analytical, such as in Men Called Love, both the slide projection and the book. Born in Belém do Pará, a city close to the Amazon forest, London-based artist Tonico Lemos Awad also recognizes and addresses the multiplicity of beliefs that characterize his home country. In his works, Tonico Lemos Awad begins with mundane materials to construct objects, sculptures, and installations that generally depend on a delicate balance to exist and take an unusually long time to be made. Within common and insignificant contexts, the artist carries out silent displacements that potentialize the latent symbolic value of shapes and elements that normally go by unperceived, making them precious and permanent. These operations invariably involve a specific handicraft skill that is characteristic of certain regions or cultures and associated to traditional materials and techniques passed from one generation to the other. In their obsolescence in relation to the society of mass production, many of these techniques are currently nearly extinct, thus also turning Awad's work into an extensive research and negotiation with each artisan involved. Notions of luck, randomness, and the supernatural are part of his imaginary repertoire, which often incorporates symbols and images from different Brazilian religions and beliefs. And this image shows his work at the last Folkestone Triennale, where he used this figure of the figa, which is a very popular amulet in Brazil. His work also evokes a darker and more mysterious side of existence, since the awareness of death and the brevity of life are always present. These ideas of transience and belief, for instance, are perfectly illustrated in the work Clairvoyant, which consists of a sculpture made with 10 sweet potatoes arranged in a circular shape hanging from the gallery ceiling. As time passes, the potatoes germinate and their shape is transformed as the leaves sprout. For Tonico, Clairvoyant relates to the idea that someone can predict the future for someone else, or that the power of levitation is real. The motivation behind the work comes from the visual resources that support these claims: the crystal ball, the candle, the cards, incenses, and plants. And then I quote from Tonico: "I chose to suspend 10 sweet potatoes of various shapes and sizes with leather threads in a circular shape. Each potato represents a letter in this invented alphabet. It doesn't matter where the word starts or ends, but the belief that the word exists. The hanging potatoes start to create roots as if resisting the absence of soil. The leaves sprout. The small events that take place in this exposed system seem either to support or to annihilate any wish for something out of the ordinary to happen." I'll just go through some images of other works by Tonico. In his paintings, sculptures, and installations, Adriano Costa often references art historical genres or movements. However, rather than merely quoting, he combines these references with other symbolically charged objects which he finds in his immediate environment and in everyday situations. In this way, he invests them with renewed meaning. The materials he employs are often chosen for their effective value, stained letters and notes kept by the artist for years, or a torn and worn-out piece of patterned fabric. Costa's works are assembled in a calculated manner with a special concern for composition and form to explore different styles and genres. Sometimes he seems to evoke the pale, still lives of Morandi. In other moments, we can glimpse a floorwork by Carl Andre or a Russian constructivist sculpture. However, in spite of his careful attention to form, there is no attempt to disguise the fragility of the materials, and the resulting constructions often seem to be on the verge of collapse. For the installation Tapetes, rugs, Costa created a collection of floorworks consisting of different types of juxtaposed fabrics taken from old cloths, t-shirts, doormats, and rugs that he has accumulated since 2008. These were arranged in what the artist calls a pre-sculptural manner, which he describes as a moment in the process of constructing a sculpture in which the final form still has not been defined. Despite the soft quality of the materials, each assemblage is constructed in a fairly rigorous manner, combining elementary geometric shapes of different colors and textures, sometimes displaying existing inscriptions or images. In contrast to the solidity of traditional sculptural forms, these pieces, which are simply placed on the ground without any fixing mechanism, are innately unstable and transitory. Mixing great geometric rigor with a tactile appeal and a performative character, these works are also suggestive of the Brazilian neo-concrete legacy without rejecting the symbolic value inherent in the tasteless old rags from which they are built. I'm going to talk about another exhibition that he did this year, but they had pieces that were very similar to these ones that he presented at Frieze this year. Plantation, the title of his 2012 solo exhibition, refers to the European economic model that predominated in Brazil during colonial times, in which the biological diversity of nature was subjected to a rationalist, profit-driven use of land. In some of the works presented in this exhibition, Costa made use of everyday objects such as bath towels, umbrellas, and curtains. He juxtaposed traditional knitting techniques and modern art's antagonistical formal concerns to trace an allegorical commentary on Brazil's aesthetic position between the European model of modernity that characterizes its main urban centers and the spontaneous artisanal production of its backlands. And then I quote from Adriano. In Plantation, a feeling of meaningfulness inspires the viewer. The exhibition traces the germination of the slightest beans, a cane of sugar, a flowering of towels, and lily pads of felt. Costa has endowed these pieces with a sort of haphazard agency, so that this unlikely collection of urban detritus emits a subdued presence. Here, form is used to discuss the rendering of self-reflexivity, of consciousness in the material world. The work seems to suggest an animistic approach to the universe of things, indicating points of contact between the immanent and the transcendent. Well, finally, I would like to end by commenting very, very briefly on the work of Mauricio Yanez, who's another artist from São Paulo, who is perhaps the one that's more closely aligned to Schendel in relation to his intellectual investigations. Yanez has a keen interest in language, particularly the idea of gaps in language and the impossibility to convey meaning through it. Moving between visual artworks, performance, and sound, he constantly explores the limits of a triad of representation systems, language, art, and religion. In his works, these three systems are interspersed and blurred in an attempt to reveal something beyond their rigid and supposedly stable codes. In the video Baroque Alphabet, it shows a close-up of the artist's face covered in golden glitter against a dark background. One by one, he recites all the letters in the alphabet, including variations in pronunciation. In this first movement, the letters become sounds. But here, there's already a shift in language. The way in which the letters are pronounced make them acquire other meanings. For instance, the long and monotonic sound of the vowels is similar to a mantra or a religious chant. In the three other videos in the series, these units of sounds and letters are edited together to form the following sentences. Holes in the midst of language, these abyss words, and a submerged sign. However, the way in which these characters are edited, one after the other, creates a sequence of sounds whose meaning is lost in the broken rhythm of the videos. By transforming language into pure utterance, he reminds us of the durational character of Schendel's monotypes and graphic objects. And, well, finally, I would like to conclude by saying that here I do not intend to make any claim to any kind of direct affiliation between the work of these contemporary artists that I showed and the work of Mira Schendel. However, I believe that this forthcoming retrospective at Tate and Pinacoteca can provide a great opportunity to reassess some aspects of her work which have remained obscured for many reasons. And this is the first attempt to start thinking about a possible connection between her legacy and the current interest in spiritual matters by contemporary artists. Thank you.